Yes. As I failed to mention in last webinar, this webinar, we do have Wally back. So please be on the lookout for this fellow because he will be randomly popping up in our slides. And you'll need to just keep a tally of how many times you see Wally. And once again, this one is not included in the count. So your current Wally is 0.
We're on 0.
0 Wallies, that's correct. Before I get into intersections, just wanted to add one more on-road bicycle treatment. So that's what we were talking about last module, but there's just another one that I thought I'd throw in there just to kind of close out that topic, which is this idea of a bicycle boulevard, sometimes called advisory bicycle lanes. Is just like with any kind of technical jargon, depending on where you go, they're called slightly different things. But the premise is in like local streets, that's where you should be envisaging these things being installed. You no longer cater for 2 streams of traffic to be able to operate simultaneously. So rather than have one lane going that way, one lane going that way at all times, and cyclists just kind of fend for themselves, you give that opportunity to cyclists. So cyclists have a lane in each direction. Sorry, that's going the other way, those 2 arrows, but you get the idea. And then there's one middle traffic lane, and that is actually for both directions. So this is not a one-way street. This is for 2 directions of travel, both for cyclists and for the general traffic. This is just an example in Canada of this being implemented, where you can see this kind of median area or the middle traffic lane is only wide enough to be able to house 1 vehicle at a time. Whereas cyclists always have this continued bicycle lane, so they don't have to slow down and give way to cars or anything like that. This is just the signage that they use over there. The other side of the world, we probably wouldn't use this exact type of signage. We don't tend to say yields, but just something to be considerate of how you communicate this to cyclists about this arrangement. And there is an actual trial of this within Victoria in Melbourne. And this is just a bit of a graphic that's gone out for community consultation and things like that. It's actually a video, but I've just cut out little scenes just to demonstrate how it works. So you can see that there's a blue car on the bottom of the screen traveling north. I'll just call that the top of the screen north. And our cyclists are traveling in their bicycle lanes. You've got one going north and one heading south. If the vehicle going north spots another vehicle in the opposing direction, the way that this arrangement is meant to work is both vehicles would need to look and give way and ensure that there's no cyclists within the bicycle lane to get over as far as possible to enable, each other to pass one another. And then you eventually get into this scenario where that blue vehicle can pass, that red vehicle can pass. Once they've passed each other, they're able to get back into the center of the lane. So this is an actual, it has been installed now and it is being used at the moment. Just like with any type of cycling project, there's generally lots of emotions about it and lots of opinions and attitudes and things like that. There was lots of consultation with the residents along this street to make sure they're aware of how this will run and operate and what they're expected to do. It's really critical to think about, well, what type of roads would you be looking at for this? You definitely want to make sure you've got low volumes because you don't want to have lots of traffic having to be doing that, shifting across into the bicycle lane multiple times a day or, multiple times an hour, whatever it is. It's got to be low volume and it's got to be low speed. And the way that's generally managed is through local area traffic management treatments. So speed humps that are shown here. There's also one there. A little bit difficult to see, but there is one there. I got a question in there saying, how effective will this system be? They do this treatment in WA quite a bit. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it's like safe travel streets or something like that program. So they've rolled this out on a few of the neighborhoods there. This one in Melbourne hasn't yet been evaluated, so I can't really give you any statistics just yet. But certainly from a cyclist perspective, it's nice to have that continued facility all the way through. You're not just forced to fend for yourself. It's not just a sharrow there that's, indicating that you can use the traffic lane, but can be a bit uncomfortable if you've got aggressive drivers behind you or something like that. So it is a nice feeling to have this dedicated facility there. But yeah, just a bit of warning about exactly when you could be implementing these would be, once again, low speed, low volume streets. Okay, so for those that have reviewed the 360-degree footage from our last module, you would have had two different examples, one being a protected bicycle lane or Copenhagen lane with this beautiful separator there. And the other example was riding adjacent the dooring zone. So be interested in the chat if you wanted to share any of your experiences, how it felt riding in example 2, whether you noticed any difference or didn't really phase you, or you felt like, it's just there's a bicycle lane and that was fine, or if you did have any sentiments to share there, be awesome to hear your thoughts in the chat. But before we get stuck into today's agenda, which is all around intersections, I was going to spend just a little bit of time going through this assignment here. From the assignments that have been received so far and graded, they've been really excellent. So I can see that lots of people are understanding the content and using the right lingo to be able to describe, the technical jargon, which is excellent to see. So bravo for those that have already submitted their assignments. There's a few I want to get around to, so don't feel stressed if you didn't see a grade next to yours. But for those that haven't yet, please keep that in mind, that they are, as part of your completion of this course, you are required to complete this coursework. Anyway, I was just going to jump into this example because it demonstrates a relatively common risk for cyclists at intersections. And it is at the intersection of Wellington Street. So the left side most, western side of this route. If we have a look at how this looks for cyclists, so I've got these little icons here where I'm just going to drag and put a cyclist in the bicycle lane in this green section here. And I've got a vehicle. I'll just call this my green vehicle. They can be parked about there. And a red vehicle who's perhaps coming up, approaching the traffic signals there. So if this cyclist were to want to be traveling through this intersection, they're traveling through to the other side there, I might just move it a little bit along so I don't have any conflicts there. Like so. That is the general, desire line. That's where they want to travel. That's obviously the easiest way to get there, and that's what they'll be focused on. Pretty self-explanatory. My green vehicle, they're actually in a left turn lane. So you can see the symbol there. They're in a left turn lane. So they'll be moving left in this environment. And where they cross over the bicycle lane is just about there. It's a bit of an awkward little arrow, but you get the idea. So they'll be crossing over there. Not an ideal angle to be crossing. Pretty difficult to be able to see cyclists in your left mirror, wing mirror. So it's not really an ideal setup that we've got going here already. But given that on approach to this intersection, it's likely either the cyclist or the vehicle would have noticed each other just by the time you get there, to some extent, because there's lots of opportunities to sight one another. This vehicle also may be turning left. I might just push them a little bit further along, actually. So they may also be turning left here, but they actually have a giant vehicle acting as an obstruction. So they can't see this cyclist. So just to confirm, this first lane or the inner lane is a left lane. The second lane is a left and through. So theoretically, this red vehicle or orange vehicle could also be turning left. In other words, the vehicle that's on the inner lane, the green one, could be stopped, acknowledge that there's a cyclist there and is giving way. The red vehicle may just assume that they're slowing down before completing their turn and has no idea that there's a cyclist oncoming and head straight through that intersection and collide with that cyclist. So whenever you have double turn lanes in particular, they should always ring a little bit of bells to any kind of auditor or anyone within the design space that you can have this, what's called a masking effect, where the green vehicle masks the sight lines for the vehicle on the outside lane. Another fancy word for it is dynamic visual obstruction. So it's not static. It's not like there's an obstruction always there. It's dynamic. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, but it is quite a critical risk because, well, the implications of that are a vehicle turning left, crossing a cyclist lane without giving any thought as to whether, without being able to see if there's a cyclist within that space. So for those that haven't done the assignments and think they might include that little finding in your assignments, please don't, because I think that's a little bit of cheating. So try and find 3 other design risks and other things like that. So don't mention that one. But ties in perfectly with what we will be discussing today, which is all about intersections and how we manage the risks of cyclists at intersections. Intersections are generally considered the weak points in the chain, so to speak, for cyclists. It's where they're most exposed, where they're most at risk. And that's both at a perception level, as in where cyclists would rate their own understanding of risk, and also at an evidence level of where crashes are occurring. It's generally approaching to intersections and at intersections and around intersections. So significant risk, both in terms of what crash data is telling us and what the cycling community is telling us from their experience. A lot of the design guidance that we'll be going through today is actually from this American resource, appropriately named Don't Give Up at the Intersection. And it's this beautiful paper here, NACTO. They provide all their resources online as well. They've got lots and lots of good content. So I recommend heading online if you do work within this space. But the subtext to this particular guidance document is we want to be designing for all ages and abilities. So we're not just, trying to treat cyclists as they're all these lycra clad and very confident, very comfortable commuter cyclists. No, we're designing for all ages, from the young and the older in generation, that idea of designing for age 8 to 80. One of the most important things within the intersection realm, a relatively innovative treatment, is called a protected intersection. We'll go through exactly what that means if you've never heard that term before. Have a look at how those have been installed in other jurisdictions internationally. And also we'll have a look at Melbourne's protected intersection. So we've got some actual footage of what that looks like. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion around signalized intersections. We'll talk about head starts and what they mean, left turn and through treatments, things like hook turns and bicycle signals. We'll get stuck into all of that as well. So more just generic road safety interventions. All right. A protected intersection looks something like this. This is a rendition of Melbourne's protected intersection. And the first thing to note or to remind or to remember about protected intersections is they all have these little protrusions, or corner refuge islands is what they're called. And they sit at each quadrant of the intersection. So each corner of the intersection. They serve a very specific function, and that is to tighten up the radius of the curve. So any vehicle that is turning left onto the minor leg, they are forced to really, really slow down. So that's one of the critical elements of it. The other element of it is it actually creates an offset from the traffic lane or the left turn traffic lane to where the bicycle lane crosses. So traditionally, a bicycle lane would just go straight through to the other side, but instead we've got this offset. And the reason that is important, as you'll see in a few slides' time, is as this vehicle turns left, at this point, to be able to see a cyclist behind them, very difficult. Just anatomically challenging to see a cyclist there, as well as acknowledging that all vehicles have their own blind spots. The further we can offset that, the more likely it is cyclists will be passing within like the front windscreen of your vehicle, where it's much easier to be able to see cyclists. That wasn't clear, don't worry, I've got plenty of slides just to really hammer that point home. Conventional intersection on the left-hand side here. The way that 99% of our cycling network is currently operating in on-road facilities, when they approach an intersection, we're pushed to the curb side. There may be bike boxes, but not all the time. Generally, cyclists are on the curb side, which means directly to the right of them is left-turning traffic, as an example. So there's minimal offset between where the bicycle lane is and where that traffic lane is. This red triangle shaped thing is indicative of where the driver's vision is focused, where they're concentrating their attention. Okay. So in the example of a conventional intersection, you can see that cyclist is hidden. That's not really where vehicle motorists are trained to be looking. In a protected intersection, as I mentioned, the intent is to maximize this offset. So we're trying to create space between the general traffic lane and the bicycle lane. In doing so, we're also maximizing those sight lines. So cyclists that are now crossing at that conflict point are within the field of view for general traffic. So that is the general principle of protected intersections. We want to be able to create that offset, provide greater separation. The way that that is achieved is through these corner refuge islands. And all of that work is to be able to improve sight lines for left-turning vehicles. I should also clarify, I've got some, as I mentioned, because we're doing the US guidelines coming up, I've flipped a lot of the images, so they might look a little bit wonky. This one was taken out of TMR, so in Queensland. They're doing some wonderful work with their guidelines there. And I know Michael Langdon's been doing terrific work about getting more, more practitioners skilled up within this space. And it's just another example of showing how a conventional intersection differs to a protected intersection. So on the left-hand side, we've got our bicycle lane right up against general traffic lane. Whereas in a protected intersection, we've got our bicycle lane coming across there, and then general traffic lane. And we're getting this offset. So we're once again achieving that offset And once again, you'll see the use of those corner refuge islands. Really, really good example of that one. Another one of just showing on the ground of how things can look. I wouldn't necessarily call this a conventional intersection, because conventionally you wouldn't even have any degree of separation there. You'd be right up against the passenger door, but you get the idea. If a vehicle is turning left in this really acute tight turn here, it'd be difficult for them to see you as a cyclist that's traveling there. Compare that to this estate in Caloundra, up north in Queensland, where they are building protected intersections. So yeah, it's really cool to see that those are starting to be implemented and rolled out across Australia. So you'll certainly be seeing more and more of them as our understanding of how these things work and operate and how to actually implement them only improves. And hopefully with everyone here in this group, you'll be able to take this learning away and start to think about where you can install them on your own network, or where they could be retrofitted into existing parts of the network that you maintain. All right, so we've got just a few key takeaways or key points that we want to memorize as part of a protected intersection. And I see the chat's a bit quiet today, so please do remember to keep me on my toes. Ask me any questions that you have, otherwise I'll just be talking at you all day, and I don't really want to do that. But the number one most critical element here is our corner refuge islands. The reason that we need this, as I mentioned, is to be able to achieve that offset. But also, if we didn't, what would happen is a motorist might just cut the corner and just go straight across. And then we have not achieved that, slowing down of motorists or improving that line of sight issue. So that's kind of the key reason that we are recommending to install the corner refuge islands. Number two is forward bicycle queuing area. This is also just a place where cyclists know that they're able to stop and wait for the signals to then go again. You don't want to forget about where that could happen. You'd have to also consider how big this queuing area should be. How many cyclists are you expecting to be propped and waiting for the phase to start for them to head through the intersection? So it's something to consider if you're getting involved in this type of design. Number three, a motorist yield zone. Just kind of refers to that line marking, but basically somewhere where motorists can pause, prop, give way. They acknowledge that they have to give way to any crossing vulnerable road users. So pedestrians, cyclists, people in wheelchairs, even if it's an e-scooter in that environment, they have to give way to them. Number four, pedestrian crossing island or a separated facility. I think that's really a good idea as well. Maybe it's clearer to see in this right-hand image, but you can see the cyclists have their own path and the pedestrians have their own path. It's not a shared area. I think that would be a really difficult thing to encourage within this space, because cyclists would be traveling at speed, going through protected intersections likely. And if they're doing that at speed and trying to weave in and out of pedestrians, that is not a good outcome. Marissa.
Thanks, Max. We've got a question. Should the refuge island be mountable or free from vertical obstructions?
Very good question. Yes, I've got a slide later on that explains that within a bit of detail. So I might pause on
that one for later. Thank you. Thanks, Max, and thanks, Longclaw.
So that's why I would certainly recommend separating both pedestrian and cyclist traffic. Number five, pedestrian crossing of the separated bicycle lane. And you can see what they've actually done here is basically just put a zebra crossing across the bike lane, similar with what we were talking about last week in the on-road facilities. Just trying to make it clear who actually has priority at that location, because you might have pedestrians that are accessing this direction and cyclists in that direction. So you've got that conflict point. Who gives way to who? And rather than be vague or just let things run its course and whoever gets there first. I think it's a really good idea to make that as obvious as possible, and that's generally done through zebra crossing because they are most easily recognizable. So yes, cyclists should be the ones giving way. I can see there's also a question came through: should the pedestrian and bike path be raised? Absolutely. If you've got the ability to kind of raise the intersection just to further slow down speeds, it's something worth considering. I would suggest, so the one that's installed in Melbourne doesn't have raised features. This kind of device, the Corner Refuge, does a wonderful job in slowing down traffic. Just that really tight radius curve means you have to be driving quite slowly to be able to navigate that turn. So it probably makes it less of a benefit to be installing or advocating for the raised vertical deflection of the cyclist or pedestrian paths, but in principle, absolutely. Yep. All right, we'll have a look at some examples just to see, what does this actually mean in the real world? So obviously we'll head over to the Netherlands, one of the leaders within this space who've been doing these things for decades. Here's an example of a real intersection that is what we would consider a conventional intersection. So before it's had any treatments in place. I'm just going to focus on the top right quadrant and look at a cyclist that may be traveling through. So you can see there's like a little ... line. That's where the bicycle lane is. So a cyclist that wants to go through this intersection will be doing so like that. So that's the cyclist's desired path. And I'll choose a different color. I'll go into blue. If we had a vehicle that was traveling alongside of them and wanted to turn left, they'd be doing so in that motion. So the first thing that everyone should notice is this offset is very minimal. The second thing is this conflict point, where this conflict would occur, that angle is incredibly acute. And we don't want to be seeing tight angles because that's when we know that we have difficulties in traffic being able to see cyclists. So even if you could picture yourself, trying to do a left turn at that particular intersection, and there was a cyclist on your near side, it'd be very difficult to be able to spot them. You kind of just have to hope that there's no one there or that you've seen them on approach. So that's how things were beforehand. This then got converted into a protected intersection, and I'll just draw again how those two modes would travel through here. So this time cyclists are taken off-road, pass through here, and then they continue all the way through there. I think I drew that just a little bit too offset, but that general direction. And general traffic, once again, they do this. And you can see that angle now where the conflict is much more perpendicular, much more at a 90 degree, where it's a lot easier to be able to see any oncoming cyclists. Marissa.
Max, what about the truck turn paths if corner refuge areas are mountable? I think I'm reading that right.
Yes, that is correct. So similar to the question that I actually got before, and I do have a couple of slides on that in particular. So I can see a few participants eager to know how that gets, how that comes into the design process. Good thinking though. Now, this is actually what it looks like on the ground, okay? Any ideas, any thoughts about this one in particular? Why I might be a little bit questioning or think this one could do with some improvement. So this is in the Netherlands. They do have a different cycling culture to us, and certainly a different attitudes towards cycling. Yes, I can see the answer there that I wanted from Michael. The refuge island is nearly flat. Yep, bang on. Delineation can be better as well. Absolutely. I think the other one, and Michael may have also meant this one as well, but the corner refuge island is basically flush. So it's the same level as your adjacent footpath or your adjacent cycle path. It's all at one level, which is really, really strange. Like there's no curbing there. I can't see that working within our jurisdictions because we would just have, this is a opposite side of the road. So motorists would likely cut straight across this area here, reducing the effectiveness of having this facility. So I'd certainly be recommending, you know, creating this as a an actual curb and channel with some concrete infill or something like that, just so it's a little bit better at delineating this is the route that we want you to take, because at the moment having it all on one level just looks a little bit odd to me. Another example here, this one is in Maryland in the States. Similar kind of philosophy, nothing too different. There's one kind of change that I wanted to mention, which is on one of the legs, actually a bi-directional facility. See that? See at the top leg, you can actually travel as a cyclist in both directions, but in all the other legs, it's just clockwise. So that's a little bit interesting, a little bit novel. But the real thing that I wanted to share, and hopefully this explains the questions that have come through here, is we've kind of got these two different levels for the corner refuge. So you can see that there's this grey area, which they're just calling, I think it's that one, proposed stamped concrete. And then they've got this other corner refuge, which is proposed brick. And they are sitting at two different levels. Might be a little bit easier if we have a look what that looks like on the ground. So you can see the brick there. And that's just the stamped concrete. You can also see it there on the other side. And for those that have already worked that out and put those questions into the chat, the reason that you would have this approach is for long vehicles or heavy vehicles, they need the extra turning circle to be able to, you know, turn safely through there. So they're not actually obstructing any of the roadside furniture. They're not hitting the curb or anything like that. So that's why you may have those mountable aprons within these protected intersections, just to ensure that you're not getting, you know, nuisance hits all the time. Another reason why you may not want to install any signage or anything that could be struck on the curb and channel itself, because it's not uncommon to see motorists head over them, particularly long vehicles. But that is a deliberate design consideration. It'd be about doing your swept paths for passenger vehicles. Might draw this out. So if I do my swept path for a passenger vehicle and I know, yep, they can do that quite safely, that's where I will actually build my refuge to. And then you do another swept path check for whatever your check vehicle is, or your service vehicle, could be a 12.5 meter or whatever it is. You do your swept path for that. And then it says, well, they need a much wider space. So we're going to just only create this section here as above the pavement level. Got a question there. Will this kind of setup be effective at unsignalized intersections? Good question. Let's give a prize out there to Sanam from Mildura. Would it be effective at unsignalized? So even if this wasn't a signalized intersection, you would still have cyclists ideally wanting to travel through, and you'd have motorists still wanting to turn left. So because that conflict point and that angle could still theoretically exist, and even if there was no signal infrastructure, yes, you could still be looking to prioritize protected intersections as just, the preferred approach or the preferred layout. So no, it's not exclusive to signalized designs. Question there, Marissa?
We've got another question there. Is it worth shifting the stop line for bikes to tie into the curbside of the mountable apron?
Righty. I think I might need to draw this one out. So is it worth shifting the stop line for bikes to tie into the curbside of the mountable apron? So this is the stop line there. The suggestion is instead to bring it back just there, Lachlan. The curbside of the, of the mountable apron. So cyclists don't get squashed. Okay. So yes, you're suggesting bringing that stop line back a little bit. So when a vehicle's turning there, they're not in that precarious location. Yes, that's a good thing. That's good thinking. Absolutely. It's one of those things that you need to balance with the amount of space that you've got, because the more you bring this back, you also want to keep it open for cyclists traveling in that direction, so that there's not just cyclists blocking off that path as well. Because while that cyclist is waiting there for their lights to go, this cyclist is coming the other direction. It's a balance. But in theory, yes, you would want to ensure that they're not within the swept path. I mean, that should be the minimum. You absolutely want to make sure that that's not occurring. And then the greater you can provide that hold line away from that spot, the better. Excellent technical question there, Lachlan. Thanks very much. We'll give a prize out to Lachlan. Another example here, this one may look a little bit more familiar as they tend to adopt similar guidance as us. This is in the UK. It's actually in Manchester. It is called the Cycle Optimized Protected Signals, which conveniently stands for Cyclops. So it's an easy one to remember. This is the Cyclops junction. And the reason I like this one so much is because it kind of caters for different skill levels for cyclists, I suppose you could say. You may have noticed this gigantic bicycle box. It's enormous. It covers both of those through lanes, the through lane and the right turn lane. And you might be thinking, oh, hang on, aren't we doing a protected intersection? So we're actually pushing cyclists over here. Yes, absolutely, that's correct. But we also know that not all cyclists will use it. Not all cyclists will identify the need to travel in that direction. They will just use what is convenient for them. So for instance, if you're a cyclist traveling from the left here and you were like, I've got to stop at the lights, I'm just going to prop here and wait. And then I'm going to set myself up right in the middle of this intersection. And when there's a gap in traffic, I'll turn right. So that's the confident cyclist. That's what they would do. Another cyclist in that same journey may be traveling along there, and then they pause and, just make sure that there's no one there to give way to. They stop at the signals, wait for their lights to go. And they go. They stop here again. They wait for their signals. And then they go on through. So that blue might have been the wrong choice. Hopefully you can see that. But you can certainly see that that blue journey is more circuitous. It's a longer journey to take. It's not as direct. And so what they've done intentionally within this design is to cater for cyclists with both of those skill levels or both of those confidence levels. So rather than just assume all cyclists will take the path that is the protected path and it's safer for them, some cyclists will do what they feel is best for them, which is taking this red path. So really cool example. Here's what this one looks like on the ground. Another photo of just some happy cyclists riding through there. And I might jump into Melbourne's protected intersection. But before I get stuck into this, let's just launch a poll here for a second, Marissa, because I need to drink some water. Oh. All right, poll 3, module 1. Question: the most important feature of a protected intersection is maximizing sight lines between motor vehicles and cyclists. Is it conflict paint? Is it banning general traffic movements? Or is it separate phasing for general traffic and bicycle traffic?
Just gonna select your answer there. We'll leave it up for about a minute. Couple more to go. Okay, I think that's everyone's answers, Max.
Wow,
Share the
that was quick.
results. It was quick.
Oh,
All right.
there we go. 100%. This is an outstanding group, Marissa. I have
Fantastic.
never done any of these polls where everyone gets the same answer. This is the second time it's happened.
Yes, I don't think I've ever had 100%.
This group is absolutely spot on. So yes, 100%, I would agree with that answer. So congratulations. Good thinking. Close the poll and let's get stuck into Melbourne's protected intersection. So this is the before case of how things looked prior to any intervention. Just for a little bit of background, it is just on the outskirts of Melbourne's CBD. The east-west or left-right connection is a really busy commuter route for cyclists. A little bit difficult to see, but I'm just drawing on the right there. You can see there's a little green patch there. That's the bicycle lane on the curb side. And then you've got parked vehicles. So there's just a really small buffer. You actually might remember I took a photo of this one in the on-road facility with the really weird white bollard, the really narrow one. That was at this location. Anywho, that's what this looked like beforehand. So cyclists would be riding up along here. And then when they get to this point, their bicycle lane just ended. There was no treatment whatsoever until they got to the intersection. And there's a tiny little bike box for them to prop and wait. But this section was a no man's land. There was no cycling infrastructure whatsoever. Incredibly common. In fact, it used to be written in the standards just to treat things like that because there was basically no other way or recommendation to be able to deal with cyclists within that location. So that's what they did. They just did nothing. So that was the previous state. Then it transformed into this. So for those with really astute eyes, you may have noticed in the previous state, we had a left turn lane, a through lane, and then this one is through and also right. We had 3 lanes. One of those lanes got eaten up by the bicycle lane. So instead now we have a through and left and a through and right. So that's the first thing to note. And it goes back to that rhetoric that I mentioned before. If you do have any cycling corridors that have been identified as strategically important or they're of most significance to you and your community, then that can come at the detriment of general traffic. You know, we get very, very nervous about these things, but ultimately we can't pretend that we're just operating in a space where every single road user will get 100% green time at every single location. It just we're unable to create networks like that. Instead, we have to prioritize different modes in different locations. And this one is where cyclists are prioritized. So that can come at the costs of general traffic lanes. So in this example, we do have instead a separated bicycle facility heading all the way up to the intersection. And then just as we've seen in all the other examples, we've got our corner refuges that provide that offset. And rather than the bicycle lane heading through in that direction, you kind of get offset off the path there a little bit. Few interesting things about this particular site is it did go through an iterative process, this design in particular. So that corner refuge in particular, because there's not a whole lot of guidance within Australia around what to do with this treatment or how to go about this. The first approach was, let's just put something down there just to show that there is a separation between the bicycle lane and general traffic, but that eventually got knocked off. No, that's not big enough. That's not going to do anything. People will just drive straight over that. So they made it a little bit bigger and, you know, made it into this boomerang or croissant shape. But then there was a few more thinking about that as like, well, it's not really a smooth radius there for turning traffic, so that might have some unwanted effects. So they did some swept path checks and acknowledged that perhaps this kidney bean shape or jelly bean shape is a better outcome, both for general traffic and for cyclists as well. Then there was a bit of thinking about, well, what about all the queuing cyclists? Because we know that this is going to have lots of queuing occurring because cyclists really want to travel through this intersection. So let's just shave off a little bit of the space here just so we can fit in more cyclists. So that's why we have this really small curvy sausage shape. These are technical terms in case you're wondering. And finally, that was more or less adopted. It just went through another swept path check with once again those two levels being set, with the shaded being a mountable section. So it's something just a pavement level, something that's easy to mount. And then the small kidney shape corner refuge island. And that's eventually how things proceeded with that type of design. So it was iterative. It wasn't just one solution, and it's not an ad hoc or off the shelf piece of work. It does require a bit of thinking, and it is site specific. Now, for those that have ever been involved within innovative projects or any of these treatments that kind of shift from your day-to-day, you can imagine that the stakeholders required a little bit more, you know, incentivizing to be able to get over the line for this one. So this was in the city of Melbourne, and so there was lots of engineering staff that were particularly concerned from there, as well as cycling groups that were concerned about the actual mounted feature that's going to be put in what used to be their bicycle path, but now they have to deviate around it. So they were concerned about that. There were concerns from people with disabilities, whether they would be able to see that there is this obstruction, and is it going to create a tripping hazard and all these types of things. Lots and lots of different stakeholders were involved in reviewing this design. And as you can appreciate, it's one thing to be able to just talk to it and, you know, gauge the level of risk based on your own analysis done on a 2D format. But because this involves quite an innovative treatment, they decided to do a 1-to-1 scale mock-up of the intersection, completely line marked. So this is an accurate representation of this intersection that was line marked in an off-road facility away from general traffic. It was just done in a depot, so in a completely controlled environment. They gave all the stakeholders that were concerned, they said, all right, here's a bicycle, here's a control vehicle, a test vehicle. go and ride around it, see what you feel, see how it feels to get around those corner refuge islands, see what it feels like getting close to the vehicle. You know, we'll do a couple scenarios that are deliberate. This was a deliberate scenario where they actually had people walking. They had cyclists, some of them were propped back here at this hold line, some were propped here, ready to head across, and also having this left turn vehicle ready to go. So they had all these different scenarios set up just so the stakeholders felt like they could appreciate what the risks were, and they could make that discovery on their own. And it was an incredibly effective way to do it. And it's basically how this project got over the line. So a really interesting case of stakeholder engagements and trying to make sure that all parties invested have their ability to hear their thoughts and concerns. Okay, this is my last little bit on protected intersections. I told you I had a lot of content here because I understand not everyone may have come across this term before. So I wanted to spend a bit of time just to make sure that it made sense. But this is an actual example of Melbourne's protected intersection. And there's just a few slides here as we're getting closer and closer to the intersection. So this is me riding on a bicycle in the bicycle lane. This yellow arrow, it's a fun word to say, is the path of where a traditional bicycle lane would be positioned. Okay, so just remember that the yellow is like where bicycle lanes in a conventional intersection would be. This, I don't know what color that is, blue, green, whatever you want to call it, aqua arrow is the path of a left turning vehicle, which conveniently enough is what this taxi is doing. So this taxi is doing a left turn and we'll see what happens next. So this is, you know, half a second forward in time. And that's what you've got to remember. This is, it seems obvious and overt and all those types of things when you're in this environment, but in the real world, this is all happening like that. So all of these tiny little design changes and decisions make a real difference in the day-to-day or the operational aspects of the project. So once again, yellow. This is how things would look if we were cycling through it in a conventional manner. That aqua color is the path of the taxi. And this purple line indicates what we as cyclists are now doing, courtesy of the protected intersection. Once again, half a second down. Yellow is exactly where the cyclist would have been traveling. That's the angle of our taxi. You can see that's not a favorable angle. You can also see if you were there at this point, or maybe the point previous, you would need to make a decision as a cyclist. Has that taxi seen me? Am I okay to head straight through, or do I have to pump on the brakes? So that is when you need to make that decision, because if you make it at this point, it's too late. So that's kind of the critical point for cyclists. And the purple is where we're seeing cyclists now traveling. So you can clearly see the offset there is significantly increased. And also, if you have a look inside the taxi window there, the passenger window, you can see that their face is more or less right in line with cyclists where they will be crossing. So it's doing an excellent job of indicating why this design is set up like it is so that that left turning vehicle can see cyclists that are crossing, and they're not just turning left and hoping no one's there. So that's really good work. When we are looking at our protected intersections, we also need to make sure that leading up to the intersection, there is enough sight lines to ensure that both motorists and cyclists see each other. Actually, there's a New Zealand guidance that does this a little bit better, so I'll just skip straight across. But basically, you want to make sure that you don't have parked vehicles or, you know, lots of signs or lots of trees or vegetation they're going to block those sight lines because it's important both for motorists to be able to see cyclists before they get to that intersection and cyclists to see general traffic before they get to the conflict point. So it's not just one or the other, it's both of those users need to see each other. So ensuring that you've got adequate sight lines before the conflict point. Okie dokie, signalized intersections. This is our next segment of the day. And what's wrong with this photo? So another confused cyclist. I might get her out of the way here. And I also might just move that banner down a bit. So pop in the chat if you can think of anything wrong with this intersection or anything peculiar. And Michael, real world example, corner of Rathdown Street and Victoria Street, Melbourne. Green light with cyclists heading towards city. Motorists turning left. Who has legal right of way and at what point? So corner of Rathdown and Victoria. Green light with cyclists heading north towards motorists turning left. Who has legal right of way and at what point? So the road rules stipulate that if a vehicle puts on their indicators or their blinkers to turn left, a cyclist has to give way to them because they've indicated their intention to turn left. So if you were traveling behind them, you have to slow down and give way to them. The limitation with that is the assumption that the indicators are working, that vehicles are doing that, and also that they're providing enough space for cyclists to adequately stop in time before getting to that conflict point. So from a legal point of view, it's if the indicator's on, then cyclists do need to slow down and give way, but the practicalities of that is a bit more challenging. All right, what's wrong with this photo? Oncoming vehicles, yes. People not using the bicycle lane, absolutely. This fellow here, well spotted. Anything else? Any ideas where this photo may have been taken? I certainly agree the oncoming vehicle is a little bit unusual, but it's odd to have a bi-directional facility kind of on this one side and then crossing diagonally to get to the other side. Not necessarily saying that you can't do it. It's just not something I've actually ever seen in practice. This one is in Canada. A colleague of ours shared this and I thought it was an interesting example, but just another way, I suppose, you can treat that transition. Just that's where they want to get to, so make it as quick and easy as possible. All right, signalized intersections. So we'll get straight back into the content. Head start boxes, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, these may be more familiar to some than others. Certainly within Victoria, super common. Basically, at every signalized intersection, you'll see this if it's on a cycling network. Austroads, that section listed there, will tell you exactly when to implement or recommend when to implement these different storage areas. So a few things about them is not only do they provide a spot for cyclists to be able to store in front of the vehicle, making them more visible at the intersection, which is a big tick. They can also act as a little bit of wayfinding, as in where, as a cyclist, can I go next? So just as an example A, you know, if I'm pushed up right against the curbside, I may be able to turn left, I may be able to look going through, but I'm not really being encouraged to get over here and turn right. So possibly there's no cycling facilities over there on the right-hand side. We compared that to our example D, where it covers the entire, all of the lanes. There may instead be, you know, cycle facilities in any direction. So that's why cyclists may be communicated that message through the use of our head starts. The example C is actually one that I would not recommend and not one that I've seen in practice. I don't really understand the point of it. If you've ever seen that and have justification, I'd be interested to hear it, but it doesn't really make sense to have like this really narrow bicycle lane and then this one to the right as well. It just makes more sense to have one giant bike box. More information in the Austroads guide, though, if you are interested in how to deal with those head starts. But yeah, the primary purpose is just to make cyclists as obvious as possible, give them the head start at the intersection, so they're not just squished in between vehicles waiting for the lights to change. Where we're looking at left turn and through treatments, and we don't have the space to be able to install a protected intersection or the money or ability to be able to install one for whatever reason. A few other considerations you could look into. Once again, you could look into the use of sharrows. So basically communicating to cyclists, you share this traffic lane now, particularly if it's just developing. It's relatively effective for motorists that are entering a left turn lane and then they see a bike symbol, they'll be like, okay, I really need to slow down because there could be cyclists here as well. Obviously, any separation is absolutely best practice, but something else that can be considered there. This is just another version of bending out your bicycle lane, or a bent out treatment as it's referred to. So getting the cyclists out and then crossing over in that space. So you still got the conflict point, it still exists, but you're just trying to make it more obvious. And that's using the colored pavement in this instance. I have seen an example of this second one where they've also put in a speed cushion. There's a bit more space in the example I've seen. They've put in a speed cushion here. So motorists would be turning into the left turn lane, then they have this cushion that they have to, slow down for before the conflict point, and then get into the left turn lane. Really good practice, because then if there were a collision to occur, it's going to be at much, much lower speeds. And you would also need to make sure that there's another cushion nearby, otherwise motorists would just go around it. But something to consider. Okay, I like to show this example of a real intersection. I used to ride this on my commute to work when I used to ride to Brunswick. And on my way into work, I was heading from right to left of screen. So I'll just show you how that looked. This is the bicycle lane here, just adjacent the Doring zone. It's a 50km/h speed limits. It's not an ideal setup, but it's not going to stop me from riding in particular. I wouldn't say it would suit everyone, but that's not the focus of this discussion. So that's how I would start my morning, heading off to work. And when I get to the intersection, it's bicycle lane ends, but I do have these sharrows. You can see there's a sharrow there and a sharrow there, which just combines with the left turn lane. So it was an exact example of what we looked at in the previous slide of using sharrows to communicate that it's a shared space now, and hopefully raise the awareness that there's cyclists in the traffic lane. Then I would just ride on through the intersection, and then there's my bicycle lane again and continues up as normal. Not a great setup. By no means is that a perfect or an idealistic state, but it's manageable, and it felt, it didn't feel like I was putting myself in grave danger of doing that. My ride home from work, however, similar environment on the approach. So riding up against the Doring zone. And then as you approach the intersection, from there to there, no cycling treatments whatsoever. So there's no sharrows, there's no bicycle lanes, it just ended. And that's still the case today, that's still how it operates. There's also no bike box at this intersection either. But the reason I bring this up is because I think it's also important to consider how your intersection looks in terms of consistency. Consistency, both at that intersection, I mean, that should be a given. If you're doing something on one leg, it should be the same on the other, but also from other parts of the network. So have a look at the next major arterial. How is that cyclist connection treated? Have a look at the one going that way as well. How does that look? Just maintaining that consistency so cyclists and motorists have a better idea of, you know, how exactly they should be interacting in that environment. Marissa.
Max, could you consider raising the bike lane at the conflict point?
Yes, absolutely. So once again, if you do have the funds or the ability to provide raised crossing points, that's a big win for cyclist safety. It does become a bit more pragmatically challenging to be able to do that, particularly if it's on an angle. So if I just go back to the previous slide, if you were to raise just like this bicycle path, it just would be challenging to be able to implement that from a operational aspect, because you need to think about where's all my water going to be going, when does it ramp down again, and how do I know that that's not going to cause any, you know, destabilization issues. So generally, if you're ever looking at raising those conflict points, you'd also consider, well, can I just bring my cyclists up onto the adjacent footpath, because that's already raised. So can we instead use that and see if we can create a shared path in this off-road area prior to, you know, spending big bucks to try and install something in that space. But it's something worth exploring for sure. Good suggestion. Let's get a prize out there as well, Marissa. All right, I've got this other left turn through treatment, which once again does not tick the box of best practice, but is something that is, you know, all over our network, and something that we can't ignore is if we are unable to do off-road connections, and we do have these on-road connections next to slip lanes in particular, because their merge length, or this area where there's a potential conflict, is much more significant. Okay, there's a greater degree of exposure there. What can we do there? Well, what's been done here is basically lots and lots of paints, not just painting that conflict point, but painting, you know, all the way from the approach and also the extent of it afterwards, just to make sure it's abundantly clear that it's a bicycle lane. Is paint going to solve the issue? No, it's not. That conflict still exists. So not suggesting this is an easy environment to treat, but another possible remediation or option you could be looking at within this space is providing a type of bypass facility. So in this example, cyclists could potentially use the adjacent footpath, come up here, right off-road, and then turn and cross at the slip lane in a perpendicular fashion. You could look to raise that crossing point. That would be a big win. So this kind of design solution, I think, does have a better safety outcome. You do have to weigh that up with what percentage of cyclists would be using that, though, because generally cyclists riding in this environment that I'm showing on this screen, they feel comfortable doing that, and they can't be bothered doing this. It's not a perfect world. If all of us were using the one route that was always the safest all the time, then I'm sure we wouldn't have all these issues, and we wouldn't have to think about you know, best case scenario, worst case scenario. But the reality is we do have different, you know, confidence levels, skills levels. We need to really think about the context of the design, who we're designing for, and, you know, what is the best outcome for the community. And it very well may be providing both. So providing an off-road connection and providing an on-road cycle lane as well. I'm certainly not against that. Just saw one come through the chat there, Marissa. Max, in case of space constraints, do you recommend reducing speed less than 40 kilometers where protected bike lanes cannot be provided? Yes, I do. I think that's a great idea. If you're unable due to space, due to money, whatever, political will, whatever it is, unable to do that. If you are able to, get a speed reduction in there, and most importantly, bring operating speeds down. So it's not just about putting the sign up there, but the associated infrastructure to be able to support that reduced speed, then yes, that can be a viable alternative. And even in the countries that I was, talking about before, the Netherlands and the Denmark and, all the Scandinavian countries and the UK and all those countries that are doing really well within cycling infrastructure. It's not as if every single network they have is off-road. There's absolutely no conflicts whatsoever with general traffic. Not everything is grade separated there either. They do have local streets and they do mix general traffic with cycling traffic. So we don't need to think that we need to create separation in every single instance. We just need to be able to manage speeds of general traffic and just acknowledge the relationship between general traffic and cyclists. Hook turns, once again, super common here within Melbourne, within Victoria. We see these popping up at lots of intersections, just become a staple. So they started obviously just for general traffic within Melbourne CBD, and then there was an idea of we can use these for cyclists as well. For those not familiar with hook turns, have never done one before, the premise is rather than having to get in a right turn lane, you can kind of phase your journey or do it in 2 stages. So if you were traveling up here and you wanted to turn right, you can just get into this little hook turn box. You stop and wait there, and that's outside of the traffic lane, so vehicles behind you can still travel straight. When they get the red light and you get the green, you're then the first to head off, and off you go. So it's this idea of kind of turning left to be able to go right, and it's actually really useful where you have multi-lanes. So if I was a cyclist, once again, I'll start from the bottom of the screen, and that was my bicycle lane, and I wanted to turn right, I would have to, if I didn't have the bike box, I would have to cross over the through lane and cross over the right turn lane to get myself here and position myself here. Crossing over live traffic is not a comfortable experience and obviously increases your conflict points. So if you can avoid that, that's a certainly good outcome. And that can be achieved by instead just using the bicycle facility all the way to the intersection, identifying our hook turn, which on the ground looks something like that, positioning yourself in that hook turn location, and then turning right from there, as opposed to having a turn right from the actual right turn lane. Beautiful idea. It's something that I use even as a confidence cyclist. I still use that. Similar to the bypass idea is, once again, really useful, not having to get across into right turn lanes and things like that. But this bypass facility, so rather than cyclists heading across here and getting into a right turn lane there to then turn right over here, able to just prop, store and wait here. Putting a little pedestal there so cyclists can just push the button and say, hey, it's my turn to go next. And then they get to go through the intersection and that's them off on their way. Marissa.
Yeah, Max, what if there are more than one cyclist turning right?
Okay, yeah. So just in terms of the size of these bike boxes, it looks quite small there on the screen, but you could fit multiple bikes there. And if you weren't able to fit just within that space, cyclists could actually cross over the pedestrian crossing there and then set themselves up here instead. So that there is a bit of space there to be able to play with. if it was a significant issue, you could look at just building bigger bike boxes, pushing that hold line back and making this bike location bigger there as well. Oh, this was just an example of our little bypass facility. This one's installed in Adelaide here, but rather than cyclists, as I mentioned, trying to get over to this right turn lane, they just continue in their little bike lane, and then they get to this point here, and they push the button on the pedestal, and they cross over the road. So once again, just trying to reduce the amount of conflict points that you have to deal with, and you don't have to deal with that stress, really. It's a really good idea. This is one that I got sent recently. This isn't at an intersection, so, but it's got the same kind of philosophy as what we've seen before, but it's a mid-block crossing where a bicycle lane ends, and they want to get cyclists onto the other side of the road. So they kind of indicating cyclists go over here, which is this location, head along here, cross over there, and do that kind of journey to continue onto the other side. It's an interesting example. It's probably incredibly common for cyclists just to go and do this and ignore all of that, but that's just one of the aspects of working within this space. You may not be able to find solutions that are going to work for every single user within that environment. Alrighty, a few more slides and then we'll give you some time to complete your quiz. So this is just wanted to provide a bit of an anecdote from my own writing. Huge intersection, as you can see. Massive signalized intersection in Melbourne. This is light rail or tram tracks down the middle of the median there as well. And I'm going to focus on the bottom of the screen here, this section here, where you can see that there is a bicycle lane and a little bike box. That's what that section looks like on the ground. Oh, it's a little bit older because there is a bike box there as well. Oh, it doesn't extend all the way across, just to there. So that's the bike box. And although it's not on, there's a little bicycle signal just there. So it's just attached adjacent to the signal face for general traffic. So picture yourself, propped, I'll get rid of all this graffiti. Picture yourself propped in this location. Even though there's not a head start box there, I'll put myself there, no problem. That's where I was, good old Max. And I'm just waiting for my green bicycle signal to go. So that's just a bicycle lantern. It's just a green light, and it means cyclists, you get to head through this intersection. What it is communicating is cyclists, you can head through this intersection. Okay, it's saying you get the head start through the intersection. The issue is, I was at that intersection and wanted to turn right. So I saw the green light and I intuitively saw green and said, let's go, let's turn right. And so I started riding and, I probably got to this point here where all general traffic then got their green phase as well. So only the head start lasts 3 or 5 seconds or something like that. So by the 5-second mark, I got to here, and that's when general traffic started. So that's when those type of movements started. And it's just an example of, how will your users actually experience and react to the infrastructure that has been provided? Because upon reflection, I can understand that was meant to communicate a through movement, but that wasn't the movement that I wanted to undertake. And I just saw a green light with a bicycle symbol. So that's where I wanted to go. Obviously, this wasn't an example of, a near miss or anything like that, but it's a location of where that could have occurred. So a simple way that could have been potentially mitigated as a risk is just having an arrow there underneath the bicycle lantern, just to demonstrate that is the direction where your head start is, not for a right turn. And because that is such a sizable intersection, I think that's where it's probably more at risk. But just something I've, I suppose, learned from my own experience. Here's an example of the bicycle lanterns that are actually integrated into the traffic signal face itself. So they've got their own separate amber and red as well. This is in Western Australia, which I think looks quite good. It's quite a good way to do it rather than have just like a separate little face that sits by itself. Just have it all shown on the single face. Makes a lot of sense. But yeah, the premise of it is cyclists, you get the head start, off you go. You know, you're a little bit slower to get started and you're a bit slower in general, so you can enter the intersection first. So there's that kind of thinking behind it. It makes it more visible for cyclists if they're able to enter the intersection first. The other benefit is it's just a wonderful feeling to be able to get the head start as a cyclist. Even if you're being in a car and you are still sitting on red and you see all these cyclists getting the green ahead of you, you get a little bit envious, don't you? Like, oh, I wish I could go. And I think that's, yeah, it's a good thing to be able to have, just give those little perks to cyclists about choosing that as a mode choice, and not only making it more visible as they're entering the intersection, but yeah, giving them the little thumbs up for doing a good job. That is the end of today's session. So we do have a bit of time for any other questions that you may have. I did want to just share this little image here. This one is of that protected intersection that within Melbourne that was being installed. And this was the temporary traffic management that they had set up, where they just closed off the bicycle lane and, you know, no detour or anything in place. It was just merge in with general traffic, or, you know, get off the road and walk your bike. So it wasn't really handled extraordinarily well, which is a shame because it's a very good example of bicycle safety infrastructure, but the actual delivery of it didn't quite meet up to those standards. So something, as I mentioned in last module, to consider if you are delivering this stuff, have a think about exactly how all aspects of your project will work out. I've just got to quickly go through, Marissa, the homework or coursework that we need to do. So for those that haven't completed the module 2 assignment, please get stuck into that. I believe it's due on Thursday. Could be, yeah, due this Thursday.
Yeah, it is due Thursday.
Thank you, Marissa. Today's homework, we've got a 360-degree video, just as we've had previously. So we'll get you to watch that one. You'll get to see what Melbourne's protected intersection look like. So you'll get to actually see what that feels like cycling around there. And there is a quiz. So complete the assignment 2, complete module 3 quiz. And then, believe it or not, next session is our final session. And we'll have to talk about what the final assignment involves. So
yes, there will be a final assignment. So if you can get your module 2 assignment done, that would be super helpful, because there will be another one come Thursday. What day are we today? Tuesday?
It is
Thursday.
Thursday, Marissa. Yeah.
It is. So if you can get that one out of the way, we'll have the next one ready for you Thursday, but it will be our final session.
That's it. Well, thanks everyone for your time today. Good luck with the quiz. Good luck with the assignment, and I'll see you all on Thursday.
Thanks very much. See you, everyone.
Yeah, bye.